Good morning, everybody. If you can get your coffee and sit down, we'll get going. Merrick is out of town, as you know, and he asked me if I would do the introductions this morning. And if you came last week, you know we had an art historian here talking about the Tiffany window. We have another, today, an architectural historian here to talk to us about Antoni Gaudí. And the title is La Sagrada Famiglia, Antoni Gaudí's enduring spiritual gift to humanity. The Basilica of the Holy Family was designed by the Catalan Spanish architect Antoni Gaudí and is widely regarded as one of the world's great architectural and religious treasures. Although incomplete, it is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Gaudí worked on the project until his death in 1926. It's anticipated that construction will be completed in 2026 in time for the centenary of Gaudí's death. Art critic Rainer Zerbst notes, quote, "It is probably impossible to find a church building anything like it in the entire history of art." And Paul Goldberger describes it as, quote, "the most extraordinary personal interpretation of Gothic architecture since the Middle Ages." Today we have Dr. Mark Brack here. He's the resident architectural historian at the Westphal College of Media Arts and Design at Drexel University. He will help us examine Gaudí's masterpiece. He teaches a variety of courses, including the much-admired 3-term series on the history of world architecture. So please help me in welcoming Dr. Mark Brack.
Well, thank you very much. I'm honored to be invited to speak here. I hope you can all hear me. I am a professor of architectural history, and so you're going to be exposed to an academic lecture today. And what do I mean by that? Well, it means that I'm going to talk about the project in the context of the time in which it was built, the context of European culture, and especially the context of the city in which it was built, which is Barcelona, Spain. But I'm also going to talk about it in the context of Gaudí's larger career. But Barcelona, which is the capital of the region of Catalonia, and that's going to be very significant for the story I'm about to tell you because it's going to be very much tied up with Catalan nationalism. It's a beautiful city. I know 2 people on the table in the front who are going there in a couple of weeks, and no doubt many of you have been there yourself. It sits on the Mediterranean. There we go. Now, the city started to experience a tremendous amount of growth in the mid-19th century. Unlike the rest of Spain, which remained very poor, very impoverished, Barcelona always kind of looked north to Europe for more of its cultural ties. And it experienced the Industrial Revolution, and so Barcelona is going to expand greatly in the mid-19th century. Because of the growth of industry, it's going to attract a lot of people to move there. People including the father of Pablo Picasso, who will move up from Andalusia. So in the mid-19th century, it's decided to plat out the expansion of Barcelona. And that expansion is called the Eixample in the Catalan language. And this is the expansion plan. It's this kind of enormous grid that is spread out around the earlier what's called Gothic quarter, which means the old quarter. But it essentially is talking about the context of Barcelona, which is an expanding industrial city with a lot of expanding wealth and also opportunities for builders. Now, the Eixample was laid out like this. It's a really amazing scheme. It's laid out in terms of a grid, but you'll notice that all the corners of each block are cut, so that, in fact, it forms a mini plaza at the intersection of every 2 streets that you can see right there. Now, this is what Sagrada's scheme was for. It was going to be a much more open and airy and also park-like city because he expected that the interiors of every block would be left open with gardens and that, in fact, the sides of the squares would never have more than 3 of the sides filled in with buildings. That's not the way it's going to be, though, because development pressures being what they were, it's going to fill up and become very, very dense. But it will provide a great deal of opportunity for architects. Now, most of the architecture of this Eixample area, which is where Gaudi is going to do most of his work, is in the historical revivals that were typical of the late 19th century. And they drew upon many different historical prototypes for their inspiration: the Renaissance, Gothic, ancient architecture, etc. However, there's going to be a kind of avant-garde, progressive movement that's going to stand out from those other more typical mainline academic revivals, one that will be distinguished by its kind of greater creativity. And in Catalan, they call it modernismo. And you can see that on the screen. Now, in Spanish, they call it modernismo. And you'll often see books that actually just use the Spanish pronunciation, but the Catalans are very touchy about their language, so I feel compelled to use the Catalan. And modernism is going to have some parallels with other design revolutions in other parts of Europe, such as the arts and crafts, the Secession, and of course the Art Nouveau, which I'm going to turn my attention to in a minute. Now, what you're looking at is a cafe called the Forgats. And in fact, the young Pablo Picasso produced the illustration for the menu for this particular cafe. And modernism is going to emerge at a time where there's increasingly modern ideals in a variety of fields, but also a really growing Catalan nationalism. And modernism is in fact going to draw very heavily upon the Gothic. So it will be a revival style to a degree. And the Gothic makes sense because it was during the medieval time when Gothic was in vogue that Catalan was at its greatest height in terms of its independence. It was even an empire, controlled Sicily, it controlled other parts of the Mediterranean, and was an independent nation. So in looking back to that historical period makes a certain amount of sense in terms of a reflection of their native pride. But one of the things that will distinguish the Gothic that is done during this time, during this modernism, is that it's more lush. It's more free in its interpretation of Gothic prototypes and often much more sculptural. But what you'll see here is what you see in your own church, that is the pointed arch, which is the kind of characteristic hallmark of the Gothic. Now, to really understand modernism, and especially Gaudi, requires me to give you just a brief exploration of two of the great architectural thinkers of the mid and late 19th century that will influence him and others. And one of them is the English art critic and theorist John Ruskin. Now, it's hard to exaggerate this man's influence because no art critic in the world today has the kind of influence he did, but he wrote many books, people hung on his every word. And one of the things he promoted was Gothic architecture. He especially loved Italian Gothic architecture, the architecture of Venice, and he hated classicism. He hated anything to do with the ancient world or its Italian Renaissance reincarnation. And he said this: "Classicism is cold, rigid, and inhumane. It is refined, deeply erudite, and full of high culture, which regular people cannot understand." So he hates classicism, he hates the Renaissance, and he loves the Middle Ages, but he likes especially colorful Middle Ages architecture. He also adores nature, and he really promotes that artists pay close attention to nature in their work, that they really look and try to accurately depict botanical and biological specimens. And so here's one of his own drawings of dried leaves. Now, this is going to resonate greatly with Gaudi, who will also be a great lover of nature. So we'll see Ruskin's influence really around the world in terms of a kind of a greater attention being paid to nature. He also gave it a kind of religious gloss. He said, you're honoring God's creation by paying close attention to nature. He also said it had an educational value. So here's actually one of Ruskin's own drawings of a kingfisher, and I'm comparing it with a sculpture in Central Park that essentially shows this kind of accuracy or realism when it comes to naturalistic effects. Now, the other great influence on Gaudi and on many architects of the 19th century is a man called Eugène Viollet-le-Duc, and he's a French architect. And Viollet-le-Duc was put in charge of the restoration of a lot of medieval castles and churches, like Carcassonne in southern France, which maybe some of you have been to, or even Notre Dame in Paris. Well, what's interesting about Eugène Viollet-le-Duc is, unlike many restorationists whose minds are so completely enamored of the past, he came to really admire the structural rationalism of Gothic. And beyond that, he sought to create a kind of modern interpretation of it using modern materials. So he wasn't purely a revivalist. In fact, far from it. He really saw the goal of any modern architect was to use the new materials that industrialization had produced to essentially create the equivalent, the modern equivalent of the ancient structural rationalism of the Gothic. And here are some of the designs you see of his that he published in his books in 1863 and 72 that were widely purchased around the world, and including Gaudi owned a set and was very much influenced by them. And so what we are looking at is a kind of expressive structural rationalism. And I put that phrase on the screen because that's going to also be crucial to understanding Gaudi, in addition to the theme of nature that I talked about with John Ruskin. So here he is, Antoni Gaudí, who was born in Catalonia and attends architecture school in Barcelona. He comes from a family of fine metal workers, and we'll see that in fact his buildings have an incredible amount of iron detail work that is really beautiful. He is a dandy. He likes entertainment when he's young, and according to legends, I've never been able to track this down exactly, apparently when he graduated, one of his professors said, "I don't know if we're graduating a madman or a genius." And in fact, he was probably right about both. Now, early in his career, he will be inspired by revivalist ideas, and he'll also be inspired by the revival of Muslim architecture, Moorish architecture as they refer to it in Spain, because of course there is that great Moorish heritage in Spain itself. And in fact the Moors did conquer Catalonia, and so it did reflect part of the history of this region. And this is one of his earliest accomplishments. It is called the Casa Bacio. It's just been opened to the public for the first time. It's been purchased by a foundation or a bank, and now it's going to be accessible for visitation. And it's an extraordinary work because not many people were looking to Muslim architecture for their inspiration. There were a few, but most of them were doing it in kind of literal exotic pastiches. He's much more creative, and he's much more innovative in terms of his evocation of Muslim architecture. And what he's mostly drawing upon is that love of multicolored tile that you can see right here. And it's kind of strange turrets. So it's not really imitating an ancient Muslim building. It's more like a truly modern interpretation. And here's the inside, and guess what? Look at all that naturalistic ornamentation, all of those accurate depiction of birds, etc., which is part of this kind of Ruskinian influence of the time. One of the most famous features of this house, which was built for an industrialist, and which will be most of his patrons will be industrialists, is this famous palm frond fence that is based literally on palms that were growing in the garden of this estate, and again, accurately represented, but in metal. And if you remember back at that slide I showed you by Eugène Viollet-le-Duc, not entirely dissimilar to one of his ornamental designs. Now, this is, excuse me, this gateway that we can see here really gives us a foretaste to the movement that we call Art Nouveau, which I've already mentioned, and I'm sure most of you are kind of familiar with. And there'll be another bit of it in this particular example. Here's another one of his early works. Again, he's mostly going to work for very wealthy industrialists who can commission these great houses. And this is the Parkway. That's how they pronounce that, that last name. Eusebio Guay will be one of his great patrons. We'll commission many different things from him, as we will see. And it's a great urban townhouse, but I'm not going to show you the interior or much of the outside even, but I am going to show you the entryway. Because here's the entryway with these two great arches. One was for pedestrians, one is for carriages to go into the lower level where there's actually a stable in the basement of this house. But look at this extraordinary ironwork. Again, it shows his background, his family background in ironwork. Oops, sorry about that. And what it's displaying, though, is that those ironwork, and I'll show you a detail of the ironwork in a section, is displaying structurally what we call a catenary arch or Catenary Arch, if you want to use the British pronunciation. And here's a diagram of it on the screen. And what a catenary arch is, or sometimes called a chain arch, is the arch that would be formed by a loose chain or string held between your fingers. And it forms a natural curve, okay? It's a natural curve that is also the most structurally efficient of all curves. And so he's going to really admire that because he sees it as something that is, again, a kind of expressive structural rationalism like Viollet-le-Duc, but he also sees it as something that's natural. And so he's going to use the catenary or Catenary Arch extensively through his work. And it was earlier used by Muslims, so it also has a kind of historical reference. But again, look at this ironwork. Now, technically, this detailing starts before the Art Nouveau when it comes to architecture, but those swirling whiplash lines have affinities with the kind of work that's going to emerge in a couple of years throughout much of Europe. So again, this is showing the background that he comes from in terms of ironwork. These are incredibly expensive houses, as you can see, because the interiors are lavishly decorated, the outsides are lavishly decorated, usually by workmen who don't get paid that much money. But Art Nouveau. Art Nouveau is a movement that will have its heyday in the 1890s, early 1900s, and it is essentially characterized by a sense of appreciation of nature, but also a sense of curvilinearity, a kind of whiplash line, kind of like the curvature of a snake. And there are early harbingers of that movement in various graphic artists, like you can see on the screen here, and in other designers of the period, like this wonderful chair by McMurdo that is actually using kelp as a kind of design. You can see that it's looking to nature, but it also kind of has a kind of abstract feel or quality about it. And probably the most famous graphic artist of all of Art Nouveau would be Alphonse Mucha, who did many famous illustrations, including this one for Job cigarette papers. And the hair of this lady is extraordinary, right? We can't say it's natural or realistic, but it is remarkable in terms of its love of that swirling line, which becomes one of the characteristics of the Art Nouveau. Now, the real person who invented Art Nouveau architecture was a man called Victor Horta, and it's hard to know if Gaudi was aware of him. We think he might have been because of international publications, but there's going to be a certain affinity in their work. A use of metal in their designs, an honest and expressive use of metal, but also that love of the curve. And this is often identified as the first Art Nouveau building, pure Art Nouveau building. It is a house in Brussels called the Hotel Tassel, and it has a famous interior where in metal and in paint and in mosaic on the floor, you see these extraordinary, again, whiplash lines that, again, will have an affinity with what Gaudi is doing. So Gaudi is not alone in terms of kind of challenging the standards of academic taste. Most architects of the period are going to be much more accurate in terms of reviving historical styles. They'll really see as a model somebody who had designed something in the Renaissance, and they will borrow little bits and pieces and maybe recombine them in new ways. But they weren't necessarily changing those details or designs in any substantial way. They were more purely reviving ancient or Italianate Renaissance styles. These guys are going something further, though. The other great kind of parallel to Gaudi, the one who comes closest in terms of his appreciation of an almost biomorphic form of design, is going to be Hector Guimard. Now, again, we think Guimard knew about Gaudi, and Gaudi probably knew about Guimard as well. And in both of their works, we'll see this appreciation for almost a sinewy, muscular kind of architecture that implies an internal structure of bone and muscles. And his most famous accomplishment is going to be the Paris metro subway stops that I'm sure many of you are familiar with. So Gaudi is not unique when it comes right down to it, but he is different. And so we see modernism as related to Art Nouveau, but kind of a separate development, one that develops somewhat independently. But all of these people are also influenced by John Ruskin and also Viollet-le-Duc. Amazing detail here that'll kind of be paralleled by Gaudi. Okay, So let's talk about Gaudi and his works. As I said, I'm going to give you the context of Gaudi's longer career. He gets the opportunity to design a gated community that has extensive park grounds in it, called the Parkway. Same patron who built that house, that he built the house for earlier. Very, very wealthy industrialist. And it was located on what was then the edge of Barcelona and was meant to be literally a gated community. A gated community that would have private houses in it, private villas, but also this amazing park system. And on certain days, they would have markets where the public can come into this gated community, and also they would have public performances. Now, it is a public park today. It is open to the public, but eventually the city took it over because financially it never turned out to be to work as a private gated community. But its most famous feature is this. It's got a market hall down below, and above it, it's got a terrace. And the person who commissioned this, Josep Higuet, was a fervent Catalan nationalist, and he imagined that this terrace would be a place where people would perform Catalonian folk dances and have singing competitions. That was a big thing for Catalonian nationalism, especially these competitions in song. And its most characteristic feature is this amazing ceramic bench that has been imitated around the world in later times. And it's got this wonderful curvilinear quality that has nothing to do with the kind of classical colonnade for the market hall below. And what's most astonishing about it is how he decides to ornament it, because he ornaments it with what we call trencadís. And trencadís are broken bits of ceramic, tile, plates, whatever. Now, we kind of accept this kind of artistic expression today, but Gaudi's the first one who did it, because what it is really a harbinger of kind of abstract collage that emerges with people like the Cubists a decade later. It's an amazing work. He actually put the person in charge of this was his devoted assistant, Jougeau, who's responsible for doing a lot of detail work on many of his buildings. But it is an abstract composition of broken tiles and plates that is obviously pretty marvelous, and as I said, a harbinger of more radical taste to come. The park also has these things, these wild rustic viaducts, little pathways through the park that were planted with Mediterranean plants, and they have a primitivism about them that again kind of almost insinuate a close tie to nature. As you can see here, some of them even actually reinforce the hillside location. In this case, he's using a parabolic arch, and it is reinforcing the hillside. So he's willing to express or explore different materials for their emotional impact. Obviously, the impact of a smooth ceramic bench is going to be very different from a rough, rustic stone viaduct. Here's one of his most famous dwellings. It's the Casa Bacio, built for, again, a wealthy family. Now, this is a remodel job. It was a pre-existing row house, townhouse. And in fact, if you look at this overall photograph, you'll see the more normal windows up above that are rectangular, that essentially were the openings from that earlier building on the site. But it's bought by the Bacio family, and they decide to remodel it. They're going to have a shop on the ground floor that they rent out. Their suite of rooms is going to be on the second and third floor, and above that, it's going to be rental apartments that they'll derive money from. But the Casa Bacio is famous for a variety of reasons. It's, again, one of his most imaginative works, and it's also the subject of a great deal of speculation. But we think we know this about it. It seems to be a celebration more than anything of the legend of St. George, who is the patron saint of Catalonia, who they call Sant Jordi. Now, St. George, of course, killed the dragon. And if you look carefully, that spike that's coming up at the very top is probably St. George's spear. And that extraordinary roofline that is unlike any other roofline in the history of architecture kind of represents the back of the dragon, a kind of scaly spine. And what you'll notice is that the tiles morph in color as they go across. They aren't just one uniform color. And down below, well, here the trencadís is rendered in glass, colored glass, and also circular round panels. So there's that spine on the roof. This is now open to the public. Many of Gaudi's buildings are. It's still in private hands. And so there's the spine of that dragon, as you can see in the front, and those transitioning tiles, and then the spear. But what exactly the facade with its glass trinketies represents, we're not sure. Some people think it represents the underwater layer of the dragon that is slain by San Jordi. And that, in fact, it has kind of watery colors, you know, blue and green, and those ceramic circles maybe represent bubbles coming up from below. But what about those balconies up above, made out of metal? Well, some people think they maybe represent crab shells, or maybe abstracted bits and pieces of the dragon's victims. You know, according to the legend of St. George, you know, he killed lots of people, he would eat the people, and so maybe these represent bones or skulls of people. In fact, the nickname for that house is the House of Bones. Now, I put this quote up here because it's going to be very reflective and crucial to understanding Gaudi. In his studio, Gaudi kept photographs and examples of things like bones and shells and crystals, and photographs of these things as well, because he thought they really reflected God's handiwork, God's geometry, seed pods. He was fascinated by seed pods. Again, not a typical architectural compulsion. So here is the House of Bones, and some of its detailing definitely looks like bones or cartilage. As I said, he's really drawing upon nature, and I'm showing you, this is a kind of joke photograph on the right. When it was taken, I didn't realize the lady was in front. But she is really mimicking the nature of that building really pretty closely. In terms of her form and the narrowness of the straps, you know, of her... when I got the picture after, I just cracked up. I just couldn't believe it. So anyway. And that symbolism kind of goes inside. So this dragon's spine is even the spine of the staircase that goes up to the top floors. There's also an elevator in the building. And then here's the main room overlooking the boulevard. Again, these curving, swirling lines that kind of give a sense of maybe undersea setting, you know, and that wild light, which might be a sea anemone of some kind, but again, rather abstracted. Let me go back for just a second. Now, when you come here and you go on the tour of this building, walk up to that window, because they'll let you open and close those windows. Those windows are curved. They are double hung, or they're sash windows. They're wood sash windows, and they operate with the barest touch of your fingers. They are so perfectly balanced and detailed, despite, you know, I can barely get my own windows open in my house, and these things just work like they're butter. Now, about a couple blocks away is this extraordinary house, one of the most radical designs in the history of domestic architecture, perhaps the most radical design. It's an apartment building. It's an apartment building called the Casa Bacio. And it's still an apartment building, although now it's condos largely, although they do let the public in. There's a museum inside that's wonderful, as well as a roof garden, which we'll see in a second. But it was commissioned by Mr. Mila, and again, an extraordinary work. Now, most of you looking at it are probably thinking, well, it's made out of concrete. It's not. That's carved stone. That is carved stone, interestingly placed on the first steel-framed domestic building built in Spain. So he's combining traditional stuff and modern stuff in a way that's extraordinary. But he loves masonry. He loves stonework. Now, Gaudi's work has always drawn a lot of attention. You just can't build something like the Casa Bacio without having critics. And so here's an early cartoon from a Catalan magazine showing, in fact, how they think this would be the proper use of this place because it looks so space-agey to them in some ways, so a Zeppelin hangar. Most people call it La Pedrera, which means the quarry. Now, as I said, it is a steel frame, which allows a rather free interior development. It's not set up as a kind of just a simple grid. And it's going to have two great light wells on the inside for light to come into these apartments. But if you look at that building, and again, imagine it as a residence, it's really rather shocking. To me, it looks like a kind of eroded cliff on the seaside. And in fact, those balconies look like seaweed that have been thrown up against it, right? Extraordinary. Who would think of this as a model for a house, for a domestic structure? But I'm about to throw in something that'll maybe make your interpretation of this building a little more uncomfortable, because this is going to be another big theme in Gaudi's work. Gaudi proposed to put at the corner of this building, which is in the Eixample, it's on one of those cut corners, an enormous statue of the Virgin Mary, which would give us a very different impression of this building if there's a huge statue of the Virgin Mary in the front. But Gaudi, in the course of his life, becomes increasingly more religiously devoted, one would even say fanatical. And that was part of the original scheme for this enormous statue of the Virgin. Now, it will be rejected by the man who pays for this, who builds this structure, because there are going to be anti-clerical riots in the early 20th century in Barcelona against the church, and he thinks it's just going to make his building a target if he puts a giant statue of the Virgin Mary. And when I say giant, I mean several stories tall. So it would have less of that pure abstract feeling or strangeness that we have if it had that Virgin Mary on it, right? It would be a little more mainline religious in a way that might make some people uncomfortable. And he's going to use those catenary arches in the roof. He makes very efficient arches, often out of brick and stone. They're often very lightweight, but again, he likes the efficiency of that arch. And so that's going to form the roof line of this building. And then to provide a wonderful kind of wonderland for the residents, he provides a roof garden that has a floor that's kind of like a roller coaster. It goes up and down and swirls around, and it has these amazing statues on top that function as both chimneys and air vents for the apartments that are, again, open to a lot of interpretations. Are they the cowls of medieval monks? Are they the helmets of medieval soldiers? We're not sure. Some of it has to be just more purely abstract and probably naturally or naturalistically based. But this is the roof garden, and you can visit it today. Okay, one last structure before I get into the Sagrada Famiglia. And this is a church that he is going to start and work on at the same time he's working on the Sagrada Famiglia, and it's going to be its closest parallel. It's not really a church, it's a chapel. And it was built on the outskirts of Barcelona for, again, Eusebi Güell, his great patron, because his patron had an industrial facility out there, a workers' village, and this is going to be a chapel for the workers. Unfortunately, it'll never be finished, but here's a surviving drawing kind of showing what he was hoping to do with the building, which is a foretaste, obviously, of Sagrada Famiglia. What he did finish was one of his most abstract and compelling works. He finished the Crypt. Now, what I'm showing you right now is a very important historical document because it's a photograph of the kind of structural models that Gaudi made. Gaudi made models out of birdshot and cloth sacks, and then he hung them upside down to try to create those catenary arches, okay, in their most efficient form. And then essentially he would reverse the building from that model because he's relying on gravity to essentially provide those arches, those natural curves. So here is actually an example that he and his staff is producing for this crypt structure, or for the superstructure of this building that is never erected. But it shows his kind of working methodology. He wants to be, in some ways, closest to the natural form of that arch because he thinks it's an incarnation of God's physics. He really thinks that its efficiency is reflective of God's genius. The buildings, the porch is asymmetrical, and it's got these weird kind of entryways to it that, again, challenge our expectation of symmetry and balance, and even the idea of having upright piers or columns like we have in this room. These ones that are tilted at rather extraordinary degrees. But the inside is really the amazing thing. It's a small place, but out of brick and stone, including using some natural basalt columns that will naturally crystallize into a kind of hexagonal form, he creates this space. It's almost like going inside of a dinosaur skeleton because you're seeing this exposed structure that looks like vertebra and spines above your head, but again, that are expressed in a way that he thinks is incredibly structurally rational. So while this might look completely irrational to our eyes when we walk inside, to him, it's not. It's completely rational and reflective of God's rationality. You can notice one of those basalt columns. And they don't bother to even finish them. What you'll notice is he likes that rawness, that the capitals on top of the other ones are very roughly cut. So he likes that kind of primitive feeling. Amazing work. And in fact, the work is even more amazing because it has some arches that fly off of other arches in terms of the support, in a way that when I was inside with a bunch of students a few years ago, we were trying to figure out how on earth it was actually being supported. And you can see those arches intersecting that lower arch on that particular image right there. Okay, so on to, at long last, the subject of my lecture. La Sagrada Famiglia. La Sagrada Famiglia. Now, La Sagrada Famiglia means the Holy Family. The Holy Family. And I really have to explain to you the context of this church politically. It will be commissioned as an expiatory church. And what do I mean by that? It's to expiate the sins of Barcelona, of Catalonia. After the Franco-Prussian War, a priest in Spain essentially promoted the building of Sacré-Cœur in Paris, that very famous church on the hill, also as an expiatory chapel. They said, oh, it was obviously our sinfulness why we lost to the Germans in the Franco-Prussian War. So this is commissioned, the initial person who's commissioning it is doing it as an expiation of the sins of himself and his countrymen. And what sins were those? Well, he was an example of a very reactionary form of Catholicism. And among those sins were things like democracy, labor unions, protests, anarchism, etc. In fact, one of the popes actually condemned democracy back in the 19th century. So it is as radical a building as we're about to see, and as exquisitely beautiful a building as we're about to see. It is also initially inspired by some very, I would think would make most people in here rather uncomfortable, a kind of political background. So an expiatory chapel dedicated to the Holy Family, Joseph, Mary, and Jesus. And it will be first commissioned, and the first commission is going to be given to a mainline Gothic revival architect. It's going to look like a Gothic building, kind of more like yours, you know, more standard academic building. Then Gaudi is going to take that position over. And over the series of decades that he works on it, he will evolve his ideas about this building into creating what we are familiar with today. You also know that it has a long and tortured history in terms of trying to be finished, but that's certainly no different from the models of medieval cathedrals. Do you know that no French cathedral has ever been finished? They might look like it, but in terms of their initial designs, none of them have all the towers and spires that they had hoped. And many of them did take hundreds of years to build, so that's no problem. Apparently one person said, "When do you think this will be finished, Mr. Gaudi?" And he said, "I'm not worried about that. My client isn't in a hurry." And he's referring to God. So, this is the first part that would be finished that we saw down there. Every part of this building will have a religious signification. This is the Nativity Facade. It's the facade that is finished during his lifetime, and it's a celebration of Christ's birth. And here it is under construction. And this is what it looked like at about the time that Gaudi died. Now, I was talking to somebody before the lecture tonight, and this is pretty much how it looked 40 years later. They had made some more progress on another one of the facades, but work is going to continue very, very slowly after Gaudi's death. The biggest impediment to building the structure is going to be the Spanish Civil War. Now, as you know, the Spanish Civil War was a particularly vicious event in Spanish history, and Catalonia was notoriously a kind of hotbed of leftists and liberal thought. And unfortunately, when the Spanish Civil War broke out, the Catholic Church was completely aligned with the fascists, with Franco. And at a certain point during the war, Gaudi's studio was broken into. His papers were burned, his models were smashed, and consequently, we have very little in Gaudi's hand to base our idea of what he wanted to make this building like. So we've lost a lot of records. Now we'll see some models that have been remade based upon fragments of the original models that were smashed, but it was a great tragedy to have that. And even though he was admired as a Catalan nationalist, the people who broke into this, anarchists, communists, essentially were very anti-religious in their sensibilities, and so attacking the church made sense. You know that there was massacres of nuns and priests and stuff like that during the Spanish Civil War. It was truly a terrible thing, as civil wars usually are. Now, today though, it is an incredibly popular tourist site. Now, that's for a couple of reasons. Barcelona has become a prime spot on the international tourist route. It wasn't like that 35 years ago. One thing, what changed things? In 1992, Barcelona held the Olympics, and they used the unfinished Sagrada Famiglia as their symbol, as their motif. And it's going to bring a lot of attention to Barcelona, and this is going to be one of the few Olympics that really benefits the city in which it's held. They had incredible planning. The person in charge of it actually was an architect, and they were able to remake their city. And ever since then, money has been flooding in. So that when I was there, I had been there in 1986, and then I was there again, I think, in 2011. I couldn't believe the change, because when I saw it, it wasn't that different from this. There was no interior when I was here. There was a crypt, but no upper interior. The interior is now finished. But this brings up a big problem. How do we finish the Sagrada Famiglia? Because Gaudi's drawings don't survive. That's one of the problems. The drawing you're looking at right now was commissioned about 15 years after Gaudi's death, after those original drawings were destroyed, by people who, and it was worked on by people who had worked with Gaudi. And they're drawing upon their memory of what they think he wanted to do. Okay, so this is a secondary document when it comes right down to it. It was not produced during his lifetime. It's based upon the memories of people who had worked with him. Nevertheless, it provides the main document that people are using for finishing the building today. Here's another one of these wonderful drawings. But the other problem is this, in trying to complete Gaudi's vision. This represents the change in Gaudi's conception of the building over those several decades. He's appointed in the 1880s. He works on this for nearly 40 years. Gaudi constantly changed his ideas. Sometimes he tore down stuff that he had built. Which means what? Well, Gaudi, to build a building that is Gaudi's, he would have to live forever in order to finish it, because he's always changing his ideas. So you would never have an authentic Gaudi building without Gaudi on site, because he's always changing. So you can see that in the evolution of his taste. You might say that his death is almost an artificial point, right? And the design of this building. So look at how it's becoming more organic over time. Look at those arches, right? Look at how more expressive of the catenary and more tree-like forms that are being used. And he's also becoming more ambitious in terms of height. And again, a lot of this is based on his evolving ideas, his experimentations with models and structures, etc. Now, when you go to Sagrada Famiglia today, I want to say something that I hope you remember. Make sure you go into the crypt, into the basement. Most tourists do not, because it's an amazing museum in there. It's a museum showing fragments, recreations of the models as they were going to build it, bits and pieces of his drawings that survive. It really helps explain this building perfectly. But again, most tourists don't take advantage of it, and they don't go into the basement. So here's a contemporary model. Many of these models have been fabricated using digital technology, very modern technology. But it can give you a sense of, first of all, how the building's going to look when it's finished, but also his changing ideas over time. So here's the conception from 1900 to 1913. Next to it is this, 1913 to 15. Well, he started to introduce an enormous choir in the galleries. In fact, it's going to have the biggest choir of any church in Europe when it's finished. And here it is later. So there are definite changes that are taking place in his thinking about this building over time, because it is a living thing. Well, Gaudi never married. And as I said, later in life, he became progressively more religiously devoted, even fanatical. He fasted. He barely ate enough to keep himself alive. He slept on a simple bed. He dressed badly. He rarely bathed. You know, it's that kind of thing. He just ended up being so devoted to his work that he didn't pay any attention to himself when it came right down to it. And after 1910, he pretty much refused work on any non-religious project. So there we go. In the course of his lifetime, when he was working on it, we know, though, he would visit his old patrons and other wealthy Catalonians, and he would go to their doors, knock on it. There's that crazy old Gaudi, and he would ask for money to continue work. A lot of it was just him going door to door begging that kept it going while he was around. Now, here is some of the interior displays in the crypt. And what you should notice in these models is that there are some older parts of that plaster of Paris that are discolored. Well, those are the fragments of those earlier models that were smashed by the revolutionaries. And they have recreated those models based upon those fragments. You can see some of the interior, some of the original details there. So it's going to be its final appearance in terms of its plan. And here's the Nativity Facade. Now, the Nativity Facade was finished during his lifetime, but here's fragments of that model that was done during his lifetime as well, obviously, that show which parts survive. Now, as I said, Gaudi's taste will always be criticized. And there's a very famous critic of this building that you all know about. George Orwell was present during the Spanish Civil War, and he wrote a very famous book about it that you might have read. He also loathed this building. He said it was perhaps the most hideous building ever created. And he was really sorry that the leftists didn't blow it up when they controlled the city. Pretty amazing in that regard, right? So let's look at the Nativity Facade. The Nativity Facade has wonderful sculptures that reflect different aspects of the birth story of Christ in it, including animals and shepherds and angels, and here's obviously the Virgin Child and Joseph. He had a sculptor who he worked with very closely, and it depicts both wonderful and horrible aspects of that story. Here we are looking up at it. You can see that the Virgin is being crowned the Queen of Heaven within a rustic grotto. Well, that rustic grotto is making a reference to a place that Gaudi was very much in love with, because in Catalonia, the most sacred site of all is Montserrat, which means the serrated mountain. Come on, where's Montserrat? There it is. Montserrat. And it's got a church at the site with an image of the Virgin, the Black Virgin, that is reputed to have miraculous powers. And so this is the holiest site in Catalonia, so making a reference to it with those kind of organic forms makes a great deal of sense for Gaudi. Go back a little. So extraordinary. Here are the angels kind of trumpeting the birth of Christ. Here is, to me, one of the most tragic images in all of church architecture. It's the murder of the innocents. And this Roman soldier is literally lifting this child up. As you can see, the mother's begging, and he's going to smash it down. There's other dead babies at the feet of the soldier. And there's the escape into Egypt onto the left. And there's the crowning of the Virgin. And at the very top, well, there's a Christmas tree. All right, and it's Nativity. And in fact, one aspect of his work that I don't think is entirely successful is the parts that, to the right of that angel, they kind of look like they're waves coming out. That's supposed to represent snow, because Christ is supposedly born in December, it's snowy, and I don't think it really looks like snow, but, you know, give the guy a break. Snow is hard to produce in architecture. And then those great, amazing towers that, again, are structurally incredibly efficient. Has this beautiful staircase that you walk down if you choose to, that you can take an elevator to the top and then walk down. And at the top, again, he has this wonderful example of Trencadis, with Hosanna and Excelsior and other kind of exhortations of the divine. And lots of crystalline forms. The church has a wonderful exhibit on nature's influence on Gaudi, and it has depictions of things like plants and seed pods and crystals, and how he was inspired by them. And in fact, this smaller slide that you see on the right is describing how a particular form of crystal is used in those towers as an inspiration for the design. And then, because of his close adherence to looking at nature, it's going to have some extraordinary animals on its cathedral, ones you usually don't see. But in fact, he'll use as gargoyles animals often associated with the earthly, more base animals. They're God's creation, but they're still rather base. So lots of snakes. And according to my knowledge, it's the only cathedral with massive snails crawling up and down it, including snail trails, as you can see behind them. Which is, again, just kind of amazing that he is inspired by all of this. But of course, all those shells have wonderful structural kind of aspects to them as well. So again, he's willing to go in directions that normal people aren't, you know, and to appreciate things that other people would say, on a church, really? Are you kidding? And he's able to get away with it. So, opposite the Nativity Facade, which is actually one of the transepts, is the Calvary Facade, and it's pretty much finished now. It's been under construction, and it's got that extraordinary kind of grotto-like entry that you can see with those great struts coming out. That is Gaudi's design. Again, very abstractly done, but rather controversially, a modern sculptor was given the commission for the sculptures for the Calvary Facade. And these sculptures have been often criticized by the people who have done them because the other facade has very naturalistic imagery, which is more in keeping with Gaudi. Some people like them. It's a notable Catalonian sculptor, but it's also received a lot of criticism. He tried to be inspired in some of the abstractions of the images of the Roman soldiers by Gaudi's actual designs for chimneys and things like that. But again, it won't necessarily be to everybody's taste, but a decision was made that they shouldn't try to copy the aesthetics of that time during this time in which it was being finished. They thought it would be a kind of historical, you know, an empty historical gesture here. Okay, we're going to go inside the church, what you've been waiting for. This is the little rosary chapel, and this was finished during Gaudi's life. So it's the closest kind of interior space that we have in the cathedral of what he intended when it was actually built. And it has more of that mainline kind of Gothic sculpture in it, especially that rib-groin vault that you see up above in the ceiling. But it also has other features that are, again, rather magical, that reflect the spirit of the times. Again, praying to the rosary to expiate the sins of the modern era. But then look up at that amazing kind of conical dome or tower. Let's look at the outside really briefly. See that up there? It goes up in a cone. It's not, you know, upright columns. They are tilted in a more structurally efficient way. And that same tilt is seen on the inside as well as very lush carving. But there's also this. There's a couple of images of demons, of the temptations of the devil, and here the devil is offering an anarchist a bomb. You can see it, right? He's reaching over and the devil's giving it to him in one hand, although this anarchist is suddenly catching a glimpse of the Virgin and hopefully going to turn down the temptation of the bomb, right? So it's answering this kind of political upheaval of the time, and there was lots of labor unrest. And even when he does have medieval kind of details in them, he really makes them much more fluid, as you can see here. Okay, well now we're going to go into the main sanctuary. Here's part of the inside of the Nativity Facade that was finished during his lifetime. And it's more mainline Gothic, although it's also more blocky, in some ways more abstract than certainly most Gothic Revival buildings. But this is where he was when he finished, and it is the most conservative part of the interior, because what we're about to see is going to be beyond belief. It is truly one of the most astonishing interiors in human history. Now, to finish this building and to make it economical, they have replaced carved stone with a lot of cast reinforced concrete. And this has been a controversial decision. But people said it's just not economical, it's a modern material, and to really make it efficient and finish it in a reasonable time, we have to resort to this. So a lot of this is cast paneled concrete. Still, it really is following Gaudi's ideas, because you come inside and you are in a sacred grove. Here he is imitating the structural form of trees. Now, what's amazing about Gothic is, again, it has a kind of great structural rationality about it. You follow the rib growing, the arches that go across from one side to the other, and they rise up almost like trees. But here he's making that reference literal, because the arches are branching out. And in fact, you can see at parts where it looks like the limbs have been lopped off. That's where little windows or stained glass light is put in, also with kind of religious exhortations. So it is structurally unlike anything we have ever seen in terms of supporting that enormous roof. Now there's an image from 2000 from National Geographic during construction of the nave, as you can see. And so you can get an idea of the structure of the place with those, again, those branches that come out and hold up the ceiling. And then look at the ceiling itself. Now when I first saw the ceiling and went inside this building, first of all, your mouth drops open, and I positioned myself, I had gone in before my students to see their reactions when they came in, and everybody just is like astonished. But those star-like elements in the ceiling I was a little suspicious about. They were a little too abstracted, but in fact they are Gaudi's original design. I looked into it, and they're meant to kind of invoke the idea of foliage. So you are looking up through this kind of sacred grove. And then this. He had always intended to have stained glass on the inside. The stained glass commission has been given to a modern artist who's done abstract windows and has chosen to create great washes of color. So instead of figural images with lots of different color in one window, it has more of a kind of modern sensibility of great expanses of different color transitioning into other colors. And what you'll notice from these images is that it picks up the complex faceting that is on the inside that reflects part of Gaudi's crystalline affectations. It also picks out other certain details very peculiarly. But extraordinary stuff, again. Very modern, obviously. This is the inside just of the nave itself. Because all the stained glass is being done, and the interior is now finished, and this is what the interior looks like. And the light tends to come, because it's a fairly large church, it just comes into the aisle section mostly. And what you're looking at underneath there, that's the bottom of the gallery where the choir is going to be. So you have, as I said, these great washes of color. Now, in terms of the overall form of those great towers, some people think he might have been inspired by adobe architecture, kind of melting sandcastle architecture of North Africa. It's all speculation in that particular case. We're not exactly sure, because he left us very precious few reference in terms of what he wanted to do. There is another great quotation for him when people said, nobody understands your architecture. He said he wasn't worried about that either, because the angels would get it. So this is what it's going to look like. That is the dome that is right over the altar. The tower above the altar is dedicated to the Virgin. The tallest tower of all is dedicated to Jesus. The 4 subsidiary towers around the Jesus Tower are dedicated to the 4 evangelists. So, when you go to the Sagrada Famiglia, you can take the elevators up the towers and you can see it under construction. And in fact, if you're going and hoping for a celestial moment with God inside of this building, I hate to dash your hopes, but the dominant sound you will hear is construction. You'll hear jackhammers and cranes and everything else, because they are working like crazy on this thing. So you don't hear the celestial choir of voices that you would hope. So here it is under construction. You can see the original model. It's been reconstructed with those fragments, and here they are building it. So here's a wonderful poster that was actually published in National Geographic, I think about, I guess 17 years ago. And the parts that are in gray are the parts that had not been finished yet at that point. And they are racing. I don't think they'll be finished in time for 2026. They have so much left to do, including the great eastern entry, the Glory Facade, which is going to be that on the left. They really haven't started. This is a picture from 4 years ago on the right. It'll be behind those kind of tubular funnels that are coming down. Oop. Now, there's a wonderful online video that you can see of the completion of this building. And it is at the Sagrada Famiglia website, where you can also buy tickets in advance and avoid the lines. I was talking to a student, and I wanted her to embed that video in my presentation. She said, well, I can do it, but it'd be illegal. And I said, well, I'm lecturing in a church. I guess I shouldn't do that. So I'm relying upon you to look it up. So here's the old man, an amazing character whose idiosyncratic vision was really, truly out of time and place in many ways, although also part of his time and place, but created something that I think most of humanity now admires because it is such a peculiar and idiosyncratic vision. He didn't build all that much in his life. I mean, mostly a few houses for very wealthy people, and then, as I said, he dedicated himself to this astonishing church, which occupied most of his time and imagination. But since I think I have a couple minutes more, I want to say when you go there, don't forget this little building that's at the base of the Sagrada Famiglia. It's a little school and studio that was built for the children of the workers on the site. And that roof, look at that wavy roof. It's a very efficient roof that is rotated around a single interior beam, as you can see, and it's made up of just 3 tiles deep on top of each other. So it's definitely also worth saying. And I also want to say about Barcelona and Gaudi is that there's this project. Apparently it never got further than a drawing. An American industrialist was visiting Barcelona and saw Gaudi's Sagrada Famiglia under construction, went to Gaudi and said, I'd like you to build a hotel in Manhattan. And apparently this is Gaudi's scheme for it, which is pretty amazing. It would have been bigger than anything in Manhattan. It was never built. It never got anywhere near being built. This is the scheme, and here's a model based on it. But obviously, had it been done, we would have had a kind of a parallel to the Sagrada Famiglia in terms of a hotel in New York. This was actually published in Popular Mechanics. Now, last but not least, I want to say that Gaudi is not alone. There's other great Modernisme designers in Barcelona, and so when you go there, it's just not him. He is the most extraordinary, the most creative, but there's other amazing designers, even designers of genius like this guy, Domènech, who was a contemporary of Gaudi's, who the city is filled with his amazing works. This is an astonishing concert hall for the performance of Catalonian music, the Palau de la Música Catalunya. And it's got lots of exposed structure like Gaudi and lots of artistry and an astonishing theater with a stained glass skylight you will not believe. Some people even go further than Gaudi. I'm going to pretty much end up with 3 slides left. This man was inspired by Gaudi. This is a building he builds for himself. He obviously has a lot of money in the Eixample. Its interior is rather frightening to me. It looks like something out of a science fiction movie. It looks like viscera hanging down, right? So he's taking Gaudi to maybe a rather uncomfortable place in one's imagination. So, Barcelona and Catalonia is an amazing place. I hope you all get a chance to visit it someday, and that you'll also get a chance to visit the Sagrada Famiglia. Thank you. Are there any questions? Sorry for bending your ear for so long. Yeah. The government and all of those tickets, it's about $20 to visit the Sagrada Famiglia. And I've also, now that Barcelona is on the international tourist destination, this is the place they go to most of all. Big ocean liners drop people off, they get in buses, they come here. They all pay admission. Sagrada Famiglia became the first attraction in the world to garner 100,000 reviews on TripAdvisor, which is that, travel site. So lots of people, government money, the church is giving money as well. So it's, they've been lucky that way. But it was essentially the Olympics that kick-started it in '92. Now, I should also say there's some criticism because Gaudi also imagined this to be the poor man's church. And I even was looking at some comments on the internet and saying, poor man's church, for all this money you spend on the poor. Yeah.
What American church that you see parallel or where this great thing? What else an industrialist has built another home that you really like? What's something?
Well, in terms of this kind of expressive rationalism and organicism, off the top of my head, I can't think of anything. There's a contemporary architect called Santiago Calatrava, who's also Spanish, who did the new terminal at the 9/11 site, with the kind of fins and things shooting out. He's probably the most close parallel. There was an architect called Eero Saarinen who also, in the 50s and 60s, did some things kind of like Gaudi in a kind of structurally expressive way. Yeah. Oh, God, I forgot. I started not looking at my notes. This is the poignant, this is how I should have ended. So let me try to do it now. The poignant coda. He didn't dress well. He looked like a beggar. He's crossing the street. He gets hit by a tram. He's taken to the hospital. They don't recognize him for a couple days. They think he's a beggar. They think he's a homeless guy. They finally recognize him. And they have a funeral, and a cortege of thousands of people were involved in it, mostly out of that sense of Catalonian nationalism and the admiration of his kind of individual genius. But no, he died unrecognized, literally, although they figured out who it was a couple days later. But he was so shabbily attired. Anybody else? Well, thanks. Well, you come up into this space. You probably have seen it. It looks like kind of wings like this coming out. It's at the base of, it's right near all the 9/11 memorial stuff. It was opened this year, or last year. Thank you very much. Oh, you're very welcome. Bye-bye.